First, let me welcome all of you to the Emerging Scholars Forum here online. And some of you are wondering, where in the world am I in terms of the beaches? Well, there's the virtual background that I have on Zoom. So you can also find that one on your background. This afternoon, we are very privileged and we are very grateful to GIA for sponsoring this particular event. And as Brian has mentioned, we will be having 3 presenters for us. We are delighted that they have joined us. And I'll introduce to you the 3 names, and then later on they will introduce the program that they'll be, the title that they'll be presenting on. First off, we will have Laura Benjamins from Western University in London, Ontario, Canada. Following her, there will be Michael Lee from Emory University, where we would have been if this was actually a physical event. And next, but not the least, John Melick from Vanderbilt University. They will each present for about 15 minutes, followed by a time of 5 minutes of question and answer. So without further ado, let me hand you over to Laura to begin our time together. Laura, over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Laura Benjamins, and I am a PhD candidate in music education from Western University. My presentation is entitled Musicking as Liturgical Speech Acts, an examination of contemporary worship music practices. Within Western Christianity's worship music landscape, contemporary music trends have grown exponentially throughout the past several decades. Starting in the early 1990s, contemporary worship, a band-based, informality-driven, and relevance-seeking way of doing worship, increased in popularity among many evangelical Christian churches. Along with contemporary worship trends, contemporary worship music, which I will refer to as CWM, developed and spread rapidly as a musical genre, imitating and shifting according to popular music characteristics. Many contemporary evangelical Christian churches today continue to use CWM as their primary musical genre, replicating Western popular music sounds, lyrical expressions, and popular music song structures. This presentation is particularly concerned with characteristics of CWM lyrics, which are described in literature as being approachable, conversational with an informal nature, and focused inwardly on the believer's personal worship experience. In considering lyrics, the worship leader, who is typically the lead vocalist or instrumentalist in CWM settings, plays a particular role in the selection and facilitation of CWM repertoire. Through the leader's consideration of the message of CWM lyrics and the formative, purposeful, devotional nature CWM plays in contemporary worship, the leader's role is integral in the creation of a space of encounter within the context of a particular praise band. As someone myself deeply committed and connected to the possibilities and potentials of the educative process, I am drawn to finding connections between the role of a contemporary worship music leader and the role of an educator. This presentation follows Calvert's assertion that speech acts in worship are leveraged toward the perlocutionary effect of spiritual formation. While Calvert states that both lyrical and musical content have a particular illocutionary force in communal worship, I extend his research to CWM specifically, exploring the role of the worship leader and in facilitating musicians' engagement in relational musicking and meeting through I-thou encounters, as based in Martin Buber's work. Thus, I argue that liturgical speech is enacted through musicking in CWM settings, forming and shaping worship musicians in terms of their spiritual formation. Throughout this examination of liturgical speech in CWM settings, I affirm Christopher Small's definition of musicking, as worship musicians and congregants do not simply make music together, but they enter into a particular space of relationship while doing so. Small's theory affirms that the meaning of musicking lies in the relationships created not only between organized sound, but between people, society, and the supernatural, which in this presentation I relate to our relationship with God. The practice of teaching in connection with worship music leadership will be viewed through the lens of Biesta and Stengel. Education as a practice, Biesta and Stengel explain, is not just a practice with a purpose, but a practice constituted by its purposes. Biesta articulates the need for a purposeful shift in the focus of teaching towards bringing something new to students in their position in relation to the world. To be taught is to be open to receive the gift of teaching, which will involve interruptions in one's understanding of the world and life. This process involves a notion of transcendence or revelation, which is described by Biesta as something coming from the outside and bringing something radically new to the teaching and learning environment. While this process of encountering something radically new moves beyond the powers of a teacher, teachers have a responsibility to help create these spaces and experiences of teaching and learning through engaging in a relationship with their students. In a religious context then, the educational aim is also to open up new existential possibilities, or that is different ways of being in and of the world. Biesta's conceptual framework may be extended to a praise band setting, where a worship leader similarly fulfills the role of an educator. Not only do worship leaders here provide musical direction to the praise band within these spaces, but they are often also expected to facilitate an experience of the divine presence through music. Kurian explains, worship leaders must not only demonstrate musical expertise and emotional engagement, but significant spiritual leadership as well. Through a worship leader's intentional and purposeful creation of spaces of teaching and learning, musicians will ideally engage with something new here, entering into a space of encounter and dialogue. Christian worship, as defined by Walter Storff, is considered liturgical when it includes a sequence of act types enacted according to a scripted text. Scripted activity here refers to the idea of types of activities that are shaped or enacted within prescriptions in force. Liturgical scripts prescribe verbal or gestural acts, primarily not for their own sake, but so that participants can thereby perform counted as actions. Liturgies, thus, are the dialogue and discourse present in congregational worship, the sequence or order of act types, such as the confession of sins, reading of scripture, or in the context of this presentation, music as part of worship. These elements of worship are directed or shaped towards a particular end. There are rituals of desire for God, present for dialogue and engagement with God. As Calvert explains, the process of believers' engagement in liturgical lines and rituals, or a sequence of act types here, connects to speech act theory. Emerging from Austin's writings on performative speech, speech act theory includes the phenomenon of one act counting as another. These performative acts can consist of doing something, the locutionary, in saying something, illocutionary, or by saying something, the perlocutionary. And renaming Austin's locutionary act as a propositional act, Searle emphasizes the notion that all speech is performative. Illocutionary forces for Searle are combined with propositional content toward an intended perlocutionary effect. And for instance, when the lyrics of a song, a CWM song selection, are performed and sung, one is engaging in a performative act of reorienting themselves towards that intended perlocutionary intent, which in the CWM environment, I believe, would be spiritual formation. Calvert explicitly explores the notion of liturgical speech acts in his research. He asserts that liturgical speech acts in communal worship are multiple, simultaneous, irreducible illocutionary forces directed towards that perlocutionary effect of spiritual formation. Within worship, locutionary speech acts coincide with those illocutionary speech acts. Worshipers perform that locutionary act of uttering the words in worship with a certain meaning in mind, and are therefore performing an illocutionary act. And while liturgical speech acts indeed serve as a significant force within worship, music in particular brings that another level of illocutionary complexity to liturgical speech acts and has various implications here for musicians meeting with one another through listening and dialogue. Within church musicking, musicians enter into a space of encounter and engagement with God and others through liturgical speech acts, forming an I-thou relationship. An I-thou relationship involves taking an immediate stand in relation to another, involving one's whole presence. All humans, according to Buber, have a common yearning to meet the other and engage in the intimacy of an I-thou encounter. When one is approaching the other, accepting and relating to the other while maintaining one's own complete concreteness, an existential position is created. This existential position is necessary for an encounter to take place, named by Buber as the between. This is the space between the relating I and the thou, and to whom the I relates. In the sphere of the between, the I and the thou are each completely present in the common event, experiencing the other side while maintaining one's own side of the relationship here. Buber describes this dialogical I-thou relation as a practice of inclusion, through which the experience is expanded. As one is meeting the other in the between by and through inclusion, engaging in an act such as musicking, I argue, musicking may be seen as a means to which dialogical relation could occur. Praise band musicians engage in meeting then, when they recognize music's meaning as worship and share in that belief while becoming mindful of themselves at the same time. They engage in self-critical questioning, such as confession and self-examination within this process of re-articulation in meeting, while also reorienting themselves to God. Rather than searching for a final answer necessarily, meaning is found in that constant dialogue between God and one another. If CWM is seen as a form of the between, music's meeting with itself and God occurs through the musician's relating and relationship to the musical encounter. As the performer continually recognizes new ways that the meaning conceives of a particular musical relationship, we understand that music is constantly reinterpreting itself here, as the performer both recognizes and constitutes that reinterpretation. A triangle may be set up to visually represent this relationship between God, music, and the praise band musician. Both the musician and God are connected through their relationship and worship here, while music furthermore mediates that relationship between the two. Similarly, music is created and written in relationship and in an act of worship with God as mediated and performed by the musician. As individuals enter into that relational quality of the between, the state, according to Buber, cannot be consistently maintained, since every I-thou relationship returns to an I-it relationship. Buber, therefore, describes the, quote, creating of social conditions conducive to the individual members meeting with the divine. Particular living centers or builders of community contribute to this between quality of relation. Which leads to individuals' encounters with the eternal you. If CWM is understood to function as a particular form of the between, a worship leader, I suggest, may therefore be viewed as a builder of community here. Similar to Biesta's description of transcendence in education, where students are presented and encounter something new, a member of a praise band may engage with something radically new in these contexts. A worship leader helps create and develop these environments, but ultimately the value is found in the musical meeting as individuals engage in the self-critical attention and reflection with themselves and the other. These environments can particularly be encouraged with the worship leader's consideration of the language of CWM lyrics and their formative, purposeful, devotional nature in contemporary worship. With these considerations then, CWM may help create spaces of meeting. With the guidance of the worship leader as the builder of community, I argue that musicians' engagement in meeting and encounter will have an impact on them spiritually. As stated in Searle's writings, illocutionary acts often intend and result in perlocutionary response. Calvert indicates, the ultimate perlocutionary effect of liturgical speech acts is the spiritual formation of the participant by way of capturing the imagination with the narrative-driven, story-shaped biblical language and practices of worship. Participating in liturgical speech acts with the added illocutionary force of music thus has the potential for an even greater perlocutionary effect of spiritual formation on musicians. In entering a space of the between, and ultimately an I-thou relationship through CWM, one might consider a process of sufficiently preparing to enter into that space. This musical and spiritual preparation is individual, where praise band musicians prepare their hearts and minds spiritually for engagement in worship, while also rehearsing their musical technique and skills before a practice or worship service. One begins their preparation at an individual level, and then from there they engage collectively with others in worship. It is necessary to emphasize that excellence in worship and engagement in adequate preparation does not necessarily refer to a level of technical excellence that must be reached in order to enter into that relationship or dialogue with God. Yet as musicians practice and rehearse to the best of their abilities, their musical technique, I believe, will likely be impacted in the process. It would also be useful to explore how various churches conceptualize the process of music learning intertwined with worship leadership. Some may allow maybe only professionals or adequately trained musicians to take part in praise bands. Others may push for that idea of musicians really learning their musical technique throughout their engagement in a praise band. So starting right from the beginning and kind of growing their skill in that way too. And regardless of these various theological implications, of course, it is also critical to acknowledge the role of praise bands in musicians' learning processes. Worship is a time of formation and ritual, intentionally aligning musicians' beliefs and understandings. Liturgies, as an inherent part of worship, are often present for the purposes of encounter and dialogue with God. As praise band musicians continue to engage in liturgical speech through CWM, their musical learning and musicking practices are affected through this environment and this engagement. This formative and purposeful nature of CWM language may have perlocutionary effects, strengthening one's spiritual formation as well as human relationships as well. And these concepts such as encounter, meeting in music, and engaging in speech acts through musicking require further consideration and exploration for church praise band contexts. As suggested within this presentation, as musicians engage in liturgical speech acts through the CWM, their musicking practices are particularly strengthened through dialogue and encounter. Worship leaders may have a role in contributing to this space of musical meeting in which musicians can enter. Therefore, liturgical speech acts function as an illocutionary force enacted in CWM with the constitutive power to shape musicians' musical learning, musicking practices, and ultimately their spiritual formation. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. So far, 3 questions have come in, all from Paul. I'm not sure which Paul. I could guess, but I'm not going to. Paul asks, I'm going to go to his second question. What is the relationship between spiritual leadership and theological understanding?
Spiritual leadership and theological understanding. I think this very much this will very much, of course, vary between churches and different denominations and beliefs in terms of leadership. And I believe, my own personal opinion, and I don't want to speak for everybody in every kind of denomination and branch of Christianity here, but there needs to be a significant theological understanding reached in order to provide spiritual direction and musical leadership, that's all as one within the context of a worship group, within a praise band group. And it depends how you see, what you view, what your church views, what a praise band group, what their role is. Is it really a mentorship, a small group kind of setting, or is it for the purposes of performing worship, leading and facilitating congregational worship as a whole? But again, I believe they are seen as leaders. They are leading the rest of the congregation in facilitating their worship. So again, I see that as you need to have a particular theological understanding or spiritual maturity there too. Oh.
2 questions have come in that are very similar. And so Paul asked it first, but I'm going to use Aaron Fulton's. Aaron says, Laura, I caught your paper on music learning in CCM at SCSM last year. In the framework you outlined here, you focus mostly on the role of musicians.
Yes.
What do you view as the role or agency of worshipers in their own spiritual formation in the CCM context? I'm thinking here particularly of congregational singing.
That's a very good question. So I am, for my dissertation research, I'm also looking at perceptions of musical agency across a variety of different genres of worship music, and this is something I'm in the process of researching more. So I do need to look more into this, but I view worshipers as individual agents and musical agents as well. But again, I very much believe that they are shaped and formed through everything, every action, every direction, exactly how a service is outlined, how a service is set up. And oh, I see, apologies I see another comment there. But yeah, I view them as individual agents, but very much shaped more than we realize. So they're shaped by our song selection, they're shaped by our musical direction, they're shaped spiritually through how a service is set up. And again, that's my whole understanding of liturgies and the purpose of why we put thought into developing service structure. How do we make these decisions? How are people shaped through every action that they're so yeah, again, this is a big debate between individual agency versus the rest of how it's, again, a sociological debate too. So I don't have an answer for this, but I'm going back and forth in my mind as I'm doing this research too.
Thank you. I think it's about time we need to move on. One of the great things about the Emerging Scholars Forum is we get great questions and great presentations. The bad part is we have to have 3 presentations. So Laura, I encourage you to look at the Q&A and feel free to respond in there. But we are going to move on to our next panelist. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Our next panelist is Michael Lee from Emory University. Over to you, Michael.
Excuse me while I set up my slides. All right, hello, my name is Michael Lee. I am a recent graduate of Candler School of Theology, THM program. My presentation it will be titled Global Songs and Cultural Appropriation, a case study of the use of arirang in European and North American hymnals. Let me get started. With the expansion of globalism and communication, it has become even easier to counter elements of a foreign culture. People are no longer confined to the borders of their own cultures, especially with the increased access to platforms such as Facebook or YouTube or Zoom. However, as people discover cultural elements which are not native to their own, which they find beautiful, the question of whether it is appropriate to mimic or reproduce them is up for debate. A tendency to seek out foreign cultural elements can also be found in the field of worship music. Under the influences of Vatican II and the ecumenical movement, more Western churches have been seeking out songs from many different traditions and cultures. The initial intent of these faith communities is by no means malicious or disrespectful, but rather an acknowledgement that the church is a part of the universal body of Christ. Nevertheless, the singing of global hymnody is by no means free from the dangers of cultural appropriation. To illustrate this point, I wish to introduce the example of the Korean folk song arirang, which has been included in some hymnals in Europe and North America, but mostly focus on its adaptation in the hymn book One is the Body by the Iona community. Please note that when referring to global songs or global hymnody, I'm referring to worship songs that did not originate from European or North American contexts. And for the lack of sufficient terminology, I will refer to European and North American churches as Western churches. But before talking about arirang, we need to think of the rationale for Western churches to be singing global songs. I suggest that intentional or not, the global hymnody trend has its roots partially, at least, in the musical exoticism that has been widely practiced in the field of Western music. Tropes of musical exoticism can be unarguably identified in famous pieces such as Verdi's Aida, Strauss's Salome, and Puccini's Turandot, and can also be traced to more modern pieces such as the musical Madame Butterfly. Musical exoticism also goes in hand with the vestiges of imperialism and colonialism of the past centuries. When Western music was imposed upon homes, schools, and missions in the colonies, while indigenous music and culture were presented archetypally, especially in operas of the time. Now, advocates of global hymnody may consider the inclusion of non-Western songs into the Western liturgy as an acknowledgement of the world church, as well as an action of reciprocity, because they, in turn, are now receiving the songs from cultures that previously received songs of Western origin themselves. However, depending on the viewpoint, the singing of global songs can also be seen as another form of exploitation towards those that were colonized in the past. Now, of course, there is room for positive reasoning for singing global songs, such as Vatican II's acknowledgement of the vernacular, or the ecumenism of the World Council of Churches, striving to bring the universal body of Christ together. However, considering the fact that the rise of the global hymnody trend, it coincides with the beginning of the discourse on cultural criticism initiated by Edward Said in 1978, my argument is that the church has not had adequate time to reflect on the negative implications of the practice of singing global songs. A more practical reasoning for singing global songs is the fact that many churches are finding themselves in a more diverse local communities. To promote inclusivity in the church's worship, as well as in ministering to the neighborhood, the singing of songs that display the diverse expressions of the people is suggested as a gesture of hospitality and inclusion to make room at the table. However, the effort to adequately represent the ethnicities that consist the congregation often results in merely enacting the stereotypes that associate certain styles of music to certain ethnic groups. In short, despite of the good intentions of singing global songs in Western churches, the end results may not always be perceived in a positive note by everybody. Now let us see how this is the case for arirang. One of the most prominent advocates and practitioners of global song is John L. Bell. He is the leader of the Iona community in Scotland, which is renowned for its significant repertoire of congregational song. In many of his publications, the Iona community includes songs that originate from many different parts of the world. One publication titled "One is the Body," Songs of Unity and Diversity. It contains a song called "While the Earth Remains." The words and arrangement are by John Bell, but the tune originates from Korea. As a person of Korean descent myself, I found it interesting that this folk song was found in a songbook intended for use in congregational singing. However, upon closer inspection, I noticed that the tune name printed for the song was Ariram. The name of the song that the tune originates is Arirang. I hope you can hear the difference, Ariram and Arirang. This may be a small spelling error, but it is only one of the many points where the Iona hymn did not properly align with the original cultural context of the tune. The words that are paired with the tune, or rather the fact that new words are paired with it at all, clearly displays how the song is divorced from its original meaning. The song Arirang is not only a title of a Korean folk song, but also a name for a larger genre of songs that contain the word Arirang in them. While there is some dispute over the etymology of the word, the songs within the genre commonly contain lyrics lamenting the estrangement of a loved one. The tune used in Iona's While the Earth Remains is the most famous of Arirangs, and it is dear to all Koreans of both North and South. It is often used in the context of efforts for unification of the two Koreas because of the common cultural implications they share, and it's even considered the unofficial national anthem of Korea. Arirang is not just any folk song, it is a song that entices emotions that are deeply rooted in the spirit of the Korean people. The fact that it was taken and modified with disregard to its original cultural context is evidence enough that the use of this hymn veers towards cultural appropriation rather than appreciation. Although it is a common practice for Bell to set his text to traditional folk music, Bell's limited understanding of Korean folk music resulted in a misinterpretation of the song. As you can see from the Romanized lyrics, the original song consists of 10 syllables per line. It's, if you may, it's a 10 meter, has 10 syllables per line, but because of the melismatic nature of the melody, it may have been difficult to distinguish which notes were to be associated with which syllables. So the text that was set by Bell is practically a totally different take on the song in terms of meter and rhythm. It's peculiarly set to 14, 14, 12, 14 meter. You can read it for yourself. But in addition, Bell also treats the last two lines as a chorus, whereas the original folk song, it repeats the first two lines that include the words Arirang as a sort of a chorus, if you can see. Any of you who have knowledge of the Korean alphabet will know that each cluster of characters represents one syllable, and we have 10 syllables per line. And this part is repeated. Now, one could argue that setting new words to existing tunes is a common practice, but this would not necessarily be true to a non-Westerner, and especially if Christianity is not the dominant religion. Adding to traditional songs words that have religious significance could also potentially be considered disrespectful or even sacrilegious. In addition, the harmonization also has problems of its own. Across the hymn, Bell utilizes harmonies that are not normative to traditional hymns, such as putting together notes in intervals of half or whole step. This is accentuated in the lower clef where the D and E or F sharp and G often collide. This gives a sense of otherworldliness, which is a technique typical of musical exoticism in Western music. Let's see how it sounds like.
God who made the earth declared it good in the beginning. Meant a time and purpose for all things that were and would be. While earth remains, there will be seed time and harvest.
Now, I must say that that is a beautiful arrangement in itself, but let's hear how it is in its original context.
Yeah.
Now, Bell is not the only one who felt short in sufficiently adapting the tune to a hymn. Arirang was first included in the Psalter hymnal of the Christian Reformed Church in North America in 1987, and later in the Presbyterian hymnal in 1990, as well as in several other hymnals under the title Christ, You Are the Fullness. It was versified by Bert Pullman and was based upon verses in Colossians. And the same mistake was made by treating the meter as irregular, as well as imposing words that are irrelevant to the original meaning of the song. And as for the harmonization, which was done by Dale Grotenhuis, hints of his effort to make the song sound more exotic can be found in the arrangement. The most prominent of this is the addition of a bass drone that is held over several measures, as you can see here. The Psalter Hymnal Handbook states that this is a device common in much Asian music. Let me repeat that. He says it is a device common in much Asian music. Now, this overgeneralization of Asian music is startling, at the least. And even if the held bass note was to be identified as a common trait in Asian music, it is certainly not the case for Arirang. It is nothing more than a device that Grotenhuis uses to make the song sound more Asian to Westerners' ears. Now, with all this complexity, it may be difficult to state concretely how global songs could be appropriately sung, even if sung at all. Although there could be an endless list of considerations, I would like to suggest three broad factors in utilizing non-original songs for worship. First, a church must display mindfulness when adding a global song in their repertoire. I use this term to describe the basic mindset a church leader or a member should have when engaging in such singing. To be mindful means to put into consideration every aspect possible in incorporating the song in worship. One must be aware of at least the basic history and or characteristics of the originating culture and music, the meaning of the original lyrics, and the shared confession of faith that is expressed in the song that can be shared or sympathized within the worshiping congregation. Another essential consideration is respect. Respect is not automatically given to a song just because it is used in worship. Geddes Hansen declares that the use of worship tools of other communities loses its authenticity as worship if it is not recognized as an expression of the corporate faith of the congregation. In other words, if a song is to be sung with proper respect in worship, it is done when the profession of faith of the originating culture expressed through the song is shared with the congregation that has integrated it into their worship. In order to show due respect by authentically sharing the song's original confession of faith, I propose the third principle, which is involvement or identity. For an authentic shared experience in the confession of the song, it is best that the congregation is in any way involved with the originating culture. Whether there are members of the congregation that identify with the foreign culture or the culture is involved in ministering to them, either locally or abroad, the songs of a culture are best shared when they are relevant to the worshiping community. When the MRI of global hymnody are put into action, a picture of an authentic experience of global hymnody can be drawn. It's a picture where one culture does not draw upon another within a power structure. It is not a mere tasting of various ethnic samples. It is one where each culture involved is mindful of the other, trying to learn as much as possible through the song being sung. And through this learning, a shared confession of faith is experienced. It's the picture where the identity of the congregation is reshaped through the respectful and mindful sharing of the songs. Within this framework, I believe that global songs can be seen as acts of cultural appreciation rather than appropriation. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Well, I think we'll have time for about two questions. The first one is from Jonathan Hain. He says, comment for Michael. You addressed this somewhat, but I wonder if you would share your views on various diaspora communities, which are very common across the US and Canada. What should we do? How should we view the admittedly problematic Western global dichotomy that you've identified in your presentation? as the size and influence of such diaspora communities grow? I'm thinking in particular of my own Presbyterian tradition and the growing size and number of Korean congregations in the US.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that is a very relevant question, especially in the context of US and Canada. But I believe that not only do like the original cultures where these diasporic communities came from, not only do they have a culture of their own, but these diasporic communities also have a culture of their own. And since you are talking from the Presbyterian tradition, I myself am a Presbyterian, and I actually saw how the hymnal kind of adapted to the diasporic communities, especially with the example of Arirang, the Christ Your the Fullness. That song was included in the previous hymnal, but in the most recent hymnal, it was excluded, and I believe that it was kind of an answer to like the culture of that diasporic community, because they themselves would never sing that song. But I think it's important to kind of identify and kind of seek out the culture of those diasporic communities, because they themselves also have different cultures as well.
Paul asks, what are the particular borders of Korean propriety that are violated by 1, pairing with the text different from the original, 2, using religious lyrics, 3, changing the syllabic count, and 4, altering a musical element?
Thank you for the question. Actually, to adequately answer this question, I think I would have to do more research on Korean folk music, but I myself am not an expert on Korean folk music. But just seeing with my own experience as a Korean, I would say that it would feel like these, well, my initial thought would be like, because as a Christian, because I am a Christian and it is being sung in a religious setting, I would at first not be angry or offended. I would be kind of, like, I would have a feeling of gratitude, but I myself would never sing it, and I myself would never bring it to my congregation, because not everybody would agree with me, and because it has such a strong sentiment within, like, almost practically everybody within the culture, just adding a different meaning to it will kind of feel like you're trying to alter that original deep feeling of sentiment. I think that could be potentially like offending. I think that's all I have for now.
I do think we have time for one more quick question. Aaron Fulton asks, does the Arirang tune appear in any Korean language hymnals? My suspicion would be that it's originally secular text, and political associations would be too present for most Korean speakers to encourage it use as a hymn tune. That
is a very good question, and excuse me, my own research actually to give you a bit of an understanding of Korean hymnals is that all denominations share the same hymnal, and it has a status, almost a canonical status. It's mostly paired with the Bible, like together, as like bound together with the Bible. So it would be very difficult for anything new to be included in the hymnal in the near future. But from what I have researched, I saw that some Korean scholars, they found the Arirang in the Western hymnals and they reintroduced it into Korea, but it has not taken off. Hardly, I don't think anybody kind of acknowledges it. This one scholar, Korean scholar, he added Korean lyrics according to the the words in Colossians, he translated those in Korean. If we were to sing that in our church back in Korea, I would agree, but I think I would be the only one to kind of agree with that.
Thank you. I think that's all the time we have. So if you want to take a look at the Q&A, there are some remaining questions as well as some things going on in the chat. Thank you, Michael. And we'll move
Thank you
on
very
to our
much.
next presenter.
Thank you, Michael, for your very interesting presentation on cultural appropriation of global songs. Our last speaker would be John Melick from Vanderbilt University. Over to you, John.
Hello. All right. Get slides here going. So hello, and thanks for having me. It's great to be here and be a part of this conference. So as you can see, my paper is called Will Work Till Jesus Comes, an analysis of economic justice issues in congregational song. And the place I'm starting is just kind of a rich scriptural tradition of our faith urging us towards economic justice. And we even have songs and poems about it in the Bible, like we see here, maybe in Isaiah or the Psalms, the Magnificat, or in Jesus's ministry. So I kind of wanted to know how well do our hymns and our songs reflect this, which is a big part of Scripture. So the main question I have here is, what do our hymns have to say about our economy?
Hey, John, if you want to share your PowerPoint, we still can't see it.
Oh, you can't see it? Okay. I didn't click the last button here. Sorry about that. How's that?
There you go.
All right. So you can see the pretty pictures. You missed those. We'll skip over this. So there's my main question there. And yeah, I also wanted to note, as part of an intersectional framework, I wanted to emphasize that economic justice needs to be a part of that intersectional framework, along with issues of gender, sexuality, race, ability, and more. So I started by identifying the largest denominations in the United States and Canada, and I ended up with 14 hymnals that I thought gave a pretty wide picture of hymnody, and I also included the CCLI Top 100 list for this year. Then I used the hymnary.org word search feature to search all of these hymnals for words that relate to economic issues. And then I also looked closely at any hymnal sections that would deal specifically with justice issues. Then once I had made note of references to economic issues, I started to categorize them, and I ended up identifying the 3 most common themes, which you can see here were economic metaphors, references to labor or daily work, and references to poverty and or wealth. So I'm going to start with economic metaphors. And these were the most common references that I found in hymns and songs. And yes, they're not truly addressing economic justice issues. So the question might arise, why analyze these metaphors? But I ended up deciding to include them. 1, because they were so ubiquitous, found in many, many songs. And 2, because I do believe that, intentional or not, the way that we use these metaphors does send a message about issues of economic justice. And so within this theme, I settled on these 3 most common metaphors to analyze, and these were evangelism as labor, sin as debt, and sinfulness or life without Christ as slavery. So starting with the evangelism as labor metaphor, we find hymns like this by Jane Laurie Bothwick. Come labor on, who dares stand idle on the harvest plain, while all around us waves the golden grain. And this metaphor is pretty common in contemporary worship songs as well. So you see, for instance, in Days of Elijah by Robin Mark, the lyric, "We are the laborers in your vineyard declaring the word of the Lord." So the general idea with this metaphor is that there is evangelistic work to be done, and Christians need to get to work. And next we have sin as debt, this metaphor, and this was another really popular trope in contemporary worship songs. This top one here is from a song called Death Was Arrested. It talks about how God canceled my debt and he called me his friend. And we also find it frequently in hymnody, like in Ruth Duck's beautiful text here, when we have missed the mark and tears of anguish flow, how can you still release our debt, our guilt, the debt we owe? And for this one, I think we can almost consider it a dead metaphor, and that it's used so much that we often don't even realize that it is a metaphor, but it's basically using the idea of a monetary debt to talk about the consequences of sin. And finally here we'll look at the slavery metaphor, which usually compares sinfulness to slavery or life without Christ as slavery. So here are a few examples from the CCLI list. I'm no longer a slave to fear, I am a child of God. And on the bottom, I'm no longer a slave to my sin anymore. And also a Charles Wesley text where he kind of refers to himself as a slave redeemed from death and sin. So moving into analysis for these are all scriptural metaphors, so it makes sense that we see them so often. And for analysis here and in the other sections with the other themes, what I'm trying to do is provide some context on current economic realities and then ask a few reflection questions based on that context. And my purpose here and in other sections is not to say that any hymn or song is wrong or that we shouldn't sing it, but just to encourage a little deeper thinking. So when we talk about evangelism as labor, I want to highlight the history of violent evangelism in North America and elsewhere, where the choice for many peoples, many native peoples, and others was to convert or die. And in light of that, a few questions. So what new metaphors could we use that affirm the sacred worth of others rather than objectifying them as items to be harvested? And do these metaphors help guide us toward healthy, respectful evangelistic practices? Looking at the sin as debt metaphor, our context is the ever-increasing consumer debt that many in our congregations will be facing. And so a question here, could we find additional ways to describe atonement or justification that do not equate debt with personal failing? And for the slavery metaphors, our context, legacy of US slavery and white supremacy still today, actively causing economic inequality and many other harms for Black people. And our question then, what does it mean to casually use slavery metaphors so frequently in our worship, especially to describe an individual's sinfulness rather than a horrific system of exploitation? So moving on to the second theme, labor and work. This was the smallest category of references that I found. Not a lot of hymns or songs about work. And the three subcategories here were labor as part of the struggle of life, asking God to empower our work, and references to labor as a justice issue. So the first one, labor as part of the struggle of life. Here we find texts where earthly labor is often juxtaposed with heavenly rest and peace. And for example, here, this is the hymn text I took the title from for this paper, O land of rest, for thee I sigh. When will the moment come when I shall lay my armor by and dwell in peace at home? We'll work till Jesus comes. And next we have songs and hymns that ask God to empower our work. So these are mainly pleas with God to aid in our daily work and livelihood. And an example here, be there at our labors and give us, we pray, your strength in our hearts. Finally, we have references to labor as a justice issue. Not many of these references that I found in hymn texts, but one good example, Albert F. Bailey, all who gain wealth by trade, for whom the worker toils, think not to win God's aid, if greed your commerce spoils. So moving to analysis for these, we can look at extremely high unemployment now and also very low wages. And also you can look at union membership at a historic low, especially in the US. And for reflection here, mainly I think we just need more songs about daily work. This is an important part of people's lives. It takes up most of their time. And so we need more songs that allow us to rejoice in dignifying work, songs that allow us to lament harm and exploitation, or build solidarity, cry out for God's justice, and prayerfully contemplate how to imbue God's goodness into our labor. And for our final theme here, poverty and wealth, I identified three main categories here: depictions of Jesus as poor, Magnificat quotes and paraphrases, and references to personal or systemic economic justice. So depictions of Jesus as poor, these are often Christmas carols. A common theme is a contrast between Jesus's earthly poverty and his heavenly glory. So example here, with the poor and mean and lowly lived on earth, our Savior holy. So these kinds of hymns talk about Jesus as living in poverty himself or caring specifically about those in poverty. Then we have congregational songs paraphrasing or quoting the Magnificat, and there's plenty of hymns that just quote the Magnificat, but some are more of a paraphrase. And what was interesting for me here was that some hymn writers seem to have varying degrees of comfort with Mary's declaration that Jesus has or will send the rich away empty. And so they paraphrase this in different ways. So we see Isaac Watts here. He avoids using the word rich and paraphrases it to, you send your judgments of the proud and justice for the oppressed. And then Paul Gibson text here uses the term wealth, but kind of uses a conceptual reversal rather than a material one. So we have, you fill the hungry mouths with food and show the poverty of wealth. And finally, we have references to personal or systemic economic justice. So looking at it on a personal level, it's kind of a condemnation of greed or materialism. This text from Reverend Thomas Phillips and Camille Harrison, they denounce the personal accumulation of wealth. Some folk worship money and the luxury it brings. Some folk live for glory, to hear their praises ring, but I live for Jesus, and to him I cling. And also similarly, riches I heed not, nor man's empty praise. And looking on at a more systemic level, I found only a few hymn texts, but there were a few like this one from Walter Russell Bowie. It says, "O shame to us who rest content, while lust and greed for gain in street and shop and tenement wring gold from human pain." So Bowie's looking more at the structures and organizations that extract wealth at the expense of human suffering. So for context here, we can see again, we're at record levels of inequality with a tiny group of people holding huge sums of money, and on the other end of the spectrum, lots and lots of people below the poverty line. And of course, we remember that on an intersectional level, these statistics are much worse with people of color and women and people with disabilities having an even smaller percentage of income or wealth. And these can be kind of abstract numbers, but I think what the numbers mean is that there will be a lot of people in our churches and in our communities who are really struggling and suffering due to poverty or inequality. So then a few reflections. I think depicting Jesus as poor can be helpful if it doesn't romanticize or trivialize poverty. And we should lean into scripture passages like the Magnificat that show Jesus's preferential option for the poor. Our congregational songs should help us point towards charity and simplicity and steer us away from personal greed and consumerism. But we also need a much more robust condemnation of the injustice inherent in our economic and political systems, which allows this inequality to grow. And then a few final thoughts. Context is key. Of course, every congregational context will be different and will have unique needs around economic justice issues. Use the great resources we have. We have some really great hymns and songs in our hymnals, and I think we should use them to sing about economic justice issues much more frequently. And finally, I hope that we can be inspired to write new hymns and songs that allow the body of Christ to lament economic injustice, build solidarity with the marginalized, condemn unjust structures, and rejoice in the gifts of God's creation. And to close out, just wanted to share one hymn that I think does all of this really well. It's from Shirley Arena Murray. This is the first stanza. Wounded world that cries for healing, here we hold each other's pain. Wounded systems, bruised and bleeding, bear the load, the scars of strain. Dollars ration out compassion, hard decisions rule the day. Jesus of the healing spirit, free us to another way. And amen to that. And I guess that's question time now.
Great, thanks, John. A few questions have come in, but if you want to ask a question, I think we'll have a little time. So Paul asks, why did you exclude supplements, which might offer more recent concerns and metaphors?
Yeah, I did consider that and ended up, because it's so hard to tell, at least for me, how widely those are used in different denominations in different areas. I chose not to include them and to just keep kind of the project within a manageable scope to look at. Certainly, the Faith We Sing in my tradition, United Methodism, is a very valuable resource in that, with some really great hymn texts dealing with this issue. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. Mary Jensen asks, John, what do you think of the word master, as in, "O master, let me walk with thee"? Here in Houston, the term master bedroom is considered racist and not to be used. I don't know about terms such as master gardener, mastermind, or master's degree. Would you use the word to refer to Jesus in a hymn?
Yeah, that's a great question. Language is always evolving, I think, and we're learning more and more. I think this is a great thing that hymnists and music ministers and all of us are becoming more aware of these issues and trying to be intentional about it. I don't know. Again, I think that comes down to context. If I was writing a new hymn, I don't think I would use the word master for myself to refer to God. Similarly with slaves, I know in my understanding, it's a much more appropriate terminology is to use enslaved persons or enslaved person, which focuses on the actual personhood rather than their exploited and oppressed status. So master is something too. I mean, Lord as well is another one that has connotations of subservience, and those are all things that I don't think I can truly answer, but it's a good question.
All right, well, thank you very much. And Swee Hong, if you want to close us out.
So I hope all of us who have gathered together for this Emerging Scholars Forum had a good time and a good learning experience. For those of us who are new to the Hymn Society, the Emerging Scholars Forum is one where we are nurturing and helping people who are entering into academia to get a taste of doing academic presentation. So thank you for coming. I really appreciate all of you. And I think you want to also congratulate our presenters, Laura, Michael, and John, for their excellent work this afternoon. I'll see you all. Take care.